Let's see the process now by which our framers led us from the days of the Puritans to the days of independence and to the Constitution of the United States. We tend to look back at that period of time and think of 1620, the landing there at Plymouth Rock. Beautiful city and a very historic city. It's nice to be there to see Plymouth Rock. It was a lot smaller than I ever imagined it would be, and all those pillars around it. I'm glad those pillars are there, because without them I don't think the Pilgrims would have found it. But we tend to lump the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the American War for Independence and the drafters of the Constitution all in one. Actually, though, going from 1620 to 1789 is a gap of 169 years, almost as large a gap as going from 1789, the year of the Bill of Rights, to today. So naturally there are some changes. What things then brought us to the point of declaring independence, fighting a war for independence, and then drafting a constitution? There are those who see our Declaration of Independence as a radical and visionary document, something brand new on the face of the earth. I don't read it that way. The colonists did not really think they were creating something brand new. Rather, they thought they were simply reasserting the ancient rights of Englishmen, rights that Englishmen had enjoyed for thousands of years. Repeatedly, they had seen those rights encroached upon. In 1215 A.D., when those noblemen gathered at Runnymede to force King John to sign the Magna Carta, they created no new revolutionary statement of rights. Essentially, what they drafted was a conservative document, even a reactionary document. They were reasserting the ancient rights of Englishmen against what they perceived to be the encroachments of a Norman king. Likewise with the English Bill of Rights. Throughout history, Englishmen reasserted their ancient rights. That's what they thought they were doing here. They believed, first of all, that they had these God-given rights that had been recognized throughout English history, that these rights were being violated by the English crown. They believed further that their colonial charters, the charters by which the King of England had authorized their colonies to be established, and these charters were in effect their constitutions, they believed that these charters gave them virtually complete autonomy over their colonial affairs, and that England was encroaching upon those charters. They believed further that Parliament had no authority over them. That saying, no taxation without representation, referred to the legal principle that Parliament had authority only over areas where Parliament had representatives. Now, in fairness to England, it should be added that England offered the colonists representatives in Parliament, but the colonists wisely refused, because that way they would be acceding to Parliament's jurisdiction. As to the king's authority over the colonists, they argued that whatever authority the earlier kings may have had at the time the charters were issued was abrogated when the Stuart kings were overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, as it's called by Protestants, of 1688. And they also said that the basic vassal-lord relationship is being abrogated. This was the basis of feudal law. The idea that if I'm a peasant farmer and I'm tired of marauders raiding my crops and burning my house every year, I go to this lord of the manor down the road and I say, I'll tell you what, I will agree to serve in your army and I'll agree to pay you taxes and obey your laws if you agree in return that you and your army will protect me the next time those marauders come. And so they made a deal. The one becomes a vassal, the other becomes a lord. But that lord of the manor may not be powerful enough to stop a lot of the marauding bands. And so he goes to a more powerful lord down the road in his castle and becomes his vassal, and he in turn to the high king, and so on. Well, the idea was a vassal-lord relationship between the colonies and England. And when in 1775 the Parliament passed a law removing the colonies from the king's protection, the colonists said, okay, the vassal-lord relationship has been ended, England has ended it, we didn't, and therefore we are of right free and independent states. And so we see the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. We sometimes say that Thomas Jefferson drafted it, and he was the primary drafter, but it was actually a committee consisting of Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Now, Congress voted to declare independence on the 2nd of July, 1776. Rhode Island did so earlier, the 4th of May of 76. And they formally adopted the Declaration on the 4th of July of 1776. A brief outline of what the Declaration has to say. It begins by saying that we are free and independent states. We are entitled to separate but equal status among nations. And we are entitled to this, it says, not by any Geneva Conventions or any UN resolution. We are entitled to this by the laws of nature and of nature's God. This declaration doesn't make us independent, but they go on to say a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that we should declare the causes which impel us to the separation. And then Jefferson goes on to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Some of the basic principles we talked about in the last lecture, that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, which include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that government does not grant these rights, rather government is instituted to secure them, that is, to protect and preserve them. That government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. You see John Locke's social compact coming in here again. And that government may be altered or abolished if it becomes destructive of these basic principles. But they weren't radicals. They said that just because there has been an abuse or a miscarriage of justice here or there does not justify us in immediately declaring independence. But rather we should do so only after there has been a long train of abuses and usurpations. Well, has there been any long train of abuses and usurpations here? Well, they say there has, and they say to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So here is their train of abuses that they cite against England. First, England has refused to assent to necessary colonial laws. England is refusing to let the colonies, in effect, govern. England has dissolved the colonial legislatures, has prevented emigration to the colonies, has made the administration of colonial justice impossible by controlling the judges and refusing to approve laws that the colonial legislatures adopted, has appointed bureaucrats to harass the colonial population, those are my words, but Jefferson's thoughts, has kept standing armies in the colonies which were not subject to the control of the colonial governments, has cut off colonial trade with the rest of the world, has engaged in taxation without representation, has denied people the right to trial by jury, has been transporting colonists for trial in England rather than in the locality where the crime may have been committed, has abrogated English common law in Canada, which may set a precedent for doing the same here, has abolished the colonial charters in many cases, has taken colonists captive on the high seas in violation of what the colonists perceived to be the law of nations, has incited insurrection among the colonists and Indian warfare against the colonists, and so they conclude that King George is therefore unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Notice that they don't say that monarchy is in and of itself wrong. Some of the people at the Continental Congress in 1776 would have believed that there is no such thing as a good king and that monarchy is of its very nature wrong. But in 1776, Americans as a whole probably had not reached that kind of a consensus. By 1787, it was different. But in 1776, people simply said that George, by his actions, has demonstrated that he is a tyrannical king. Not that the very idea of kingship itself is wrong. Many people in America wanted a king. In fact, many wanted George Washington to be king. And then the colonists say, before we declare independence, we've got a need to resolve things. Look at Daniel chapter 1, where we see how Daniel tries to resolve his disputes with the Babylonian authorities there, and does so successfully in that instance. And so they say, we have presented our grievances to the king, we have sent representatives, we've sent the olive branch petition, all of these things have gone unheeded, and so they simply declare what they say has become established fact, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And so they close them with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, and to those ends they pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. The relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution, I think, needs to be spelled out here. We'll see that the preamble to the Constitution is very short. It is the Declaration that sets forth the basic ideals of the nation, and I would say the Declaration is the true preamble to the Constitution. There are those who say that the Declaration is a radical, visionary document with lofty ideals like life, liberty, property, and equality, but that by 1787 the reactionaries had taken over and they drafted a self-serving document that was simply designed to preserve the interests of the ruling classes. I think that's nonsense. In fact, it's interesting to see that rich and poor alike benefited from the stability that the Constitution provided, that rural states and more urban and commercialized states alike supported the Constitution. And so I don't think that's a fair assessment. Assessment comes largely from Charles Beard in his economic interpretation of the Constitution back about 1900, a view that many have accepted for the last decades, but which I think has been quite well refuted. The best way to understand it is that the Declaration is the preamble to the Constitution. It sets forth the basic ideals of the nation. The Constitution sets forth a practical means by which those ideals can be realized in a society of imperfect people such as we live in today. In a sense, the Constitution is a more radical document than the Declaration because it goes much farther. It provides this practical means of representative government. So we need to view the two in the same light, kind of as two sides of the same coin. Well, we didn't have the Constitution, though, for 13 years after the Declaration of Independence. In the meantime, we were governed by the Articles of Confederation. These were drafted in 1776 by a congressional committee led by John Dickinson. They were approved in a modified form by the Continental Congress in 1777, but not all of the states had ratified them until 1781. Nevertheless, we were governed informally under them from 1777 on. It was more a compact among states than a true constitution, but it has to be given credit. The Articles of Confederation did get us through the war. There were limits to the Articles then. It certainly has to be said they did get us through the war, but just barely. And after that unifying factor of the war was gone, then things degenerated into even greater chaos than before. One of the problems is that under the Articles there was no chief executive. The closest thing we had to a chief executive was the president of the Continental Congress, who was really more like a speaker of the House rather than a true executive. There was no federal judiciary. If the Continental Congress passed a law, they had to use the state courts to enforce it. There was no federal taxing power. What they used was voluntary requisitions. In other words, contributions. What might happen is that, let's say, General Washington would write from Valley Forge, "My men are starving and freezing. I need about $500,000 to get my troops through the winter." He'd write to the President of the Continental Congress, and the President of the Congress, next time Congress was in session, would say, "Well, here's what General Washington and the troops say they need, and we think they're doing a good work. We think we ought to requisition some money for them, so let's requisition the states." So then the President of the Continental Congress would send out a letter to the 13 state governors and say to the governor of Virginia, let's say, "General Washington is in need of some funds there to carry on his valiant effort at Valley Forge. He says he needs $500,000. We think Virginia's fair share of this might be about $50,000. We'd very much appreciate it if you could contribute." And a month or so later, the governor of Virginia would get the letter, and the next time the Virginia legislature was in session, he would say, well, I think the boys at Valley Forge certainly need our support, so after we have apportioned our state budget, if there's any money left over, let's send them some. That's the way requisitions worked. And even during the war, they worked just barely. After the war, they hardly worked at all. And so that was a major weakness. Sometimes we might wish we had a weakness like that today, but it did have a problem. So you say there were no federal enforcement powers. Any act that the Continental Congress passed, a state legislature could nullify and say this act does not apply in Georgia. And the articles were virtually impossible to amend because any amendment had to be approved by all 13 states. And so a number of things led to a constitutional convention after the war was over. The fact of combined radical inflation and recession at the same time, the inability to raise funds by requisition, domestic disturbances like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, states treating each other as foreign nations for trade purposes, various border problems among the states. I mean, if you're back there around the coast, you pretty well know where the boundary between Virginia and North Carolina begins. But you get back here into the mountains and so on, back at that time, the exact boundaries might be a little more difficult to determine, and exactly where the western edge begins. That also was rather difficult to determine. There were problems also of the English massing troops on the Canadian border, possible moves by the Spanish in the west along the Mississippi and so on. And with these problems in mind, people began thinking that something beyond the Articles of Confederation was needed. Alexander Hamilton had seen this need from the beginning. You recall that Hamilton was one who consistently had advocated a stronger central government. And as a colonel in the Continental Army, serving as an adjutant to General Washington, Hamilton wrote letters urging that a stronger central government be created after the war. After the war, Hamilton persuaded his state, New York, to pass a resolution urging a constitutional convention, but no other state joined in his resolution. In 1783, Hamilton urged Congress to call a constitutional convention, but he had no success. But he did persuade one person, George Washington. And Hamilton always seemed to have Washington's ear a great deal. And in 1785, Washington wrote a letter to the 13 states urging that a new constitutional convention take place. So in 1786, Congress didn't call for a constitutional convention, but they did call for a trade conference. But only 5 states showed up for that conference, and so there wasn't a quorum, and so the conference never took place. Congress passed a resolution calling for a constitutional convention to be held in Philadelphia commencing 14 May for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Not for drafting a whole new constitution, but to revise the Articles. Well, by 14 May, delegates from only 2 states had arrived. Other more important things like spring planting took priority. But that may very well have been providential, because in the period between 14 May and 25 May, James Madison and other Virginia delegates sat down and drew up a series of resolutions known as the Virginia Resolves as to what they thought the new government ought to consist of. And as delegates from the other states began arriving, they looked at these Virginia Resolves, and those became the basic agenda for the convention itself. Arguably, the convention would never have proceeded with the order that it had it not been for those 11 days in which Madison and others were able to draft those Virginia Resolves. So the convention formally convenes on the 25th of May. It was attended by delegates from 12 states, 55 delegates in all. Rhode Island never sent delegates. These delegates were not radicals. They were the establishment of society. They were experienced, educated, intelligent. 31 of them were lawyers, but please don't hold that against them. 19 of them were military veterans, I should say at least 19. Most of these were officers. A couple were of general rank, many of colonel rank. 28 were former congressmen, and many others had served in state legislatures. 2 were college presidents. 3 were college professors. There were 9 who had been born in foreign countries. There were several doctors, scientists, and men of other professions. Most of them were fairly well-to-do. Most of them liked the established order. They were not trying to create some new revolutionary order. They were simply trying to preserve the established order that they thought had been threatened first by England and now by internal chaos. And so they proceeded in convention to establish certain rules. First, they decided to elect a president. George Washington was elected president of the convention. They decided that they would cast their votes, 1 vote per state, each vote to be cast the way a majority of the delegates from that state decided. To prevent false rumors from being spread, they decided that they would keep all proceedings secret. They didn't hold press conferences every night, and even the notes that they kept were not to be published until the last delegate to the convention died. And the last delegate to die was James Madison, and he died in 1836, and his notes were published shortly thereafter. I require my students to read Madison's notes in constitutional law too, and it's fascinating to see how the convention actually took place. That is probably the single best source of our information. Another rule was that no delegate could speak twice, more than twice, on an issue until all the other delegates had spoken, and then he could speak a third time only by permission of the convention. And to prevent side discussions from going on and angry exchanges between delegates, they decided that all remarks had to be addressed to the president. Now, we could say that the delegates agreed on certain basic principles. They agreed that there is a higher law, the laws of nature and of nature's God. They agreed that part of that law of nature is that there are God-given unalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. They agreed that government is established by covenant or contract, giving government only such limited power as the people delegate to it. They agreed that all people, rulers included, have a sinful nature, and so they would say people need order, but rulers need limits. Now, on most of the conclusions that the Constitutional Convention came to, we find that they deliberated until they reached a consensus. Maybe not unanimous, but at least an overwhelming consensus. On 3 issues, though, they had to simply reach a raw compromise. One of these was representation in Congress. The large states thought that it should be based on population. The small states said, no, every state ought to have equal representation. And they argued about that extensively. And finally, they agreed to a raw compromise suggested by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, that Connecticut Puritan in Jonathan Edwards Jr.'s church. The compromise of 1 house based on population and 1 house based on area. Doonesbury, in a cartoon on the Constitutional Convention, showed the delegates as they were in a tavern or inn across the road from the Constitutional Convention, Independence Hall. Late at night, they were arguing about what Congress should consist of. And in the next room, there was a traveling peddler. And he had a horrible migraine headache. And he was being kept awake by all this arguing by the delegates in the next room. And finally, he bangs on the wall and he says, have 1 house by states and 1 house by population. Now shut up and let me get some sleep. And the delegates in the other room, idea. And that's where they got it, according to Doonesbury. But no, it actually came from Roger Sherman. And interestingly, Sherman had suggested the same idea for the Articles of Confederation. It was not accepted then, but it was this time. The other 2 issues of compromise concerned slavery. One concerned the counting of slaves for voting and taxes. After all, if we're going to have a house that's based on population, then we've got to assess how many delegates for each state, so we've got to count the population. Now, in counting the population, do we count states? And the North says, no, we don't. The South says, yes, we do. And in apportioning taxes for each state, once again, we've got to count the population. So for apportioning taxes, do we count slaves? And the North says, yes, we do, and the South says, no, we don't. And so you see some hypocrisy, perhaps, on both sides. Finally, they reached a raw compromise that a slave would count as 3/5 of a person for taxation and representation both. Now, let's understand that for what it is. Nobody was suggesting that slaves were 60% human. This was simply a raw compromise without which the Constitution would never have been ratified. I might add, concerning the attitude of slavery, many of the delegates to the convention belonged to abolitionist societies. A few of them, particularly from the Deep South states, believed in slavery as God's order, but many of them, including many of the Virginia delegates, were personally against slavery but didn't feel that their slaves could be freed at this time because of the nature of the economy and the situation. After all, you free your slaves, how are they going to support themselves? Patrick Henry said, "How can it be that I, a Christian, am an owner of slaves?" He proceeded to speak about the evil of slavery, and then he said he could only resolve to treat his slaves as kindly as possible and to work and pray that the day would soon come when this abominable institution would be abolished from the face of the earth. James Madison declared that the entire Bible is against slavery, and yet he himself was a slaveholder. But anyway, those two issues were raw compromise, the last of them, whether the slave trade should be continued. Finally, they reached a raw compromise that Congress could not end the slave trade for 20 years, that is, until 1808. Now, part of the reason for this was that there was a general belief at this time that the institution of slavery was on the way out, and that just give it a few more years and it'll fade out on its own. And of course, something happened to change all that, the invention of the cotton gin, which made the plantations profitable once again, and so it continued for several more generations. Well, in June, the convention degenerated into a great deal of discord, and finally, on the 28th of June, Ben Franklin made his motion for prayer. The motion was not acted upon. One delegate pointed out that they lacked funds to bring in a chaplain, and the motion had been to bring in a chaplain every day for this purpose, and some of them said, well, we don't want the word to get out that there's discord here. So they adjourned without acting, but many did pray by themselves and in groups. And that led to a greater spirit of harmony. And so on the 26th day of July, the Committee on Detail was appointed to work out the details. And they made the report on the 6th of August, and the delegates refined that until the 8th of September. On the 8th of September, a Committee on Style was appointed. Gouverneur Morris did most of the actual drafting. On the 12th of September, he and his committee presented their final report. And between 12 and 15 September, the delegates considered that report and adopted it with a few minor changes. And then on the 17th of September, they gathered for the signing of the Constitution. Majority of the delegates from each state signed, but there were 3 delegates who did not: Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, George Mason, and Edmund Randolph of Virginia. Randolph later changed his mind and supported the Constitution, but another delegate who had signed, Luther Martin of Maryland, that is Luther Martin, not Martin Luther, signed the Constitution, but later he changed his mind and decided he had to oppose it. Ben Franklin then made an interesting observation. He noted the carved sun on the wooden back of Washington's chair, and he said that he had often observed that carved sun. It was only the top half of that sun. And he had wondered whether this was a rising sun or a setting sun. And he said, now I am convinced it is a rising sun. In other words, he was convinced now that America did have a great future.